I want to talk about the whole process around restructuring an organisation. The idea of this session is to give you some ideas and some warnings, frankly, about what you need to consider before embarking on a fairly major, a significant restructure of your business because of whatever reason. And actually, that's the first thing that I want to talk about. If you don't know why you're restructuring, if you can't be absolutely clear and definite about the reasons behind it, you probably shouldn't be doing it. You may not be Mikhail Gorbachev. You may not be running perestroika, which is Russian for restructuring. But any kind of restructuring, if it's large enough, needs to be carefully thought through, needs to be planned properly, and needs to be given sufficient attention to detail that you don't end up with an unholy mess at the end of it, rather than some streamlined, super efficient business model, which is probably what you've got in mind at the outset. So, first rule, be clear about what you want. The push behind your restructuring may be fairly simple. You may need to save money, cut your costs. You may need to be responding to changes in legislation or the external business environment. You may be merging with another organisation. You may be switching your business direction altogether and embarking on a new kind of activity. But the important thing is you know why you're doing your restructure and you are able to articulate that consistently and clearly to everybody that's going to be affected by it. But of course, it's also worth considering whether you can arrive at the place where you need to be through smaller, more incremental changes which don't have the same big bang effect, but which can be perhaps described as evolutionary or developmental in its approach. So be clear why you're doing it and the fact that you absolutely have to do it through a major restructure rather than those smaller incremental changes. When you embark on a major restructure, there are a number of pieces of legislation that you need to be aware of. Employment protection legislation in this country is complex, it's large, and you do need to know at least the headlines before you set off on a journey of restructuring. One of the first things that I would recommend that any organisation does is to review your managing organisational change policy. You may call it something different, but effectively the policy document that covers this kind of activity. I have lost count of the number of people I've worked with in the past who have decided halfway through a restructuring exercise that maybe they need to update the policy. That is not the time to update the policy. Look at it first before you get cracking on your restructure. And whilst you're at it, have a look at other associated and connected policies which are codependent with your managing organisational change policy. Make sure that they reflect any recent changes in legislation, that they incorporate good practice, and that they have been discussed and consulted with the people who are likely to be either your arch enemies or your best colleagues as you go through a restructuring. And those people are your trade union representatives, if you're in a unionised environment, or your staff side representatives, if you follow that model of consultation. Make sure that you embark on a really, really good programme of communication. The first people that you need to talk to are your trade union representatives or your staff representatives, whichever model you have. They are the people who will be your major challengers, but they're also the people that can do an awful lot of the work for you, because if they know what you're doing and why you're doing it, they can help you to convey that message, they can help to sell concepts and principles behind the restructuring for you. It is crazy not to involve them. And if you treat them as partners rather than as people who want to make your life more difficult, they are more likely to behave in a partnership manner. So I would recommend that very highly. Of course, it will depend on your history of employee relations with those groups of people, but wherever possible, try to get them on your side as much as you possibly can. The second thing to do is to ensure that you have consultation arrangements properly set out, understood on both sides, and that you've got the resources to undertake it effectively. Communication and consultation are at the very core of what you're trying to do. In my experience, if people understand why you're doing what you're doing, they may not like it, but they will find it easier to accept because they see the sense that sits behind it. Recent examples that Solo had was working with a client who was embarking on a programme of fairly radical change, which led to, in the end, a fair number of redundancies. And when we described a model of communication, the senior leadership team looked horrified, frankly, to begin with, because that communication model included not just these things, but primarily a weekly bulletin from the chief executive describing any developments in the course of the change programme, a weekly frequently asked questions bulletin which was updated every week with new questions that were coming in from members of staff, a monthly meeting with a forum of staff representatives, all of whom were volunteers, but who had been trained by the organisation so that they performed their duties well. They understood clearly what their remit was, and they were invaluable in getting the messages out to members of staff and bringing back the questions, the challenges, and the responses to the ideas that were being presented through the consultation framework. It was enormously time-consuming, but they didn't have a single formal challenge to the decisions that were then subsequently made about who was going to stay and who was going to go. There wasn't a single formal challenge to the structure that was proposed. There wasn't a single formal challenge to the final proposals that went through and which were implemented. And when that organisation had an Investors in People inspection, 3 months later, they got a resoundingly positive result because staff said, didn't particularly enjoy the experience, but we knew what was happening, and the senior leadership team were brilliant at telling us what was going on. So what they did was they diffused any suspicion and cynicism about the whole change. They were very honest, they were very transparent, and it was a tough time for everybody. They found it difficult to give enough time to the communication model. But I believe very strongly that what they did was preempted an awful lot of problems that may have occurred further down the line. And what a great result at the end of it. They got to exactly where they wanted to be, and the organisation is a stronger one with better policies, procedures, but more importantly, a better culture than the previous one, which was the point of the exercise. And that brings me on to another really important point. I have been talking about policies and procedures and also about communication. And I think one of the risks around living in a country with actually fairly complex and comprehensive legislation regarding things like restructuring and the changes of employment models is that we can become trapped into a view that provided we follow the law and our policies and procedures, we will be just fine. I would urge you to try and think back to a time when you were on the receiving end of this kind of exercise, if that's ever been the case, because the way we respond as human beings to major changes and a loss of control, frankly, about our working life is typically we will feel angry, upset, frustrated, demotivated, anxious, sad, all of those negative emotions. And if, as managers and leaders, we don't pay attention to that, we will come across as cold, as unfeeling, and even though the policy may be followed to the letter, people will feel disaffected from the organisation and what it is doing to them. Most restructurings will end up with still a fairly significant number of people still working for an organisation. I mean, clearly if you're closing it down entirely, that's not the case. But for most restructurings, you want to keep your good people. You want to carry on with an employment relationship with them. And the way you treat them through the restructuring will be critical to their view of you post-restructuring. So if you want to keep people motivated and believing in you as an employer, think about the way in which you respond to them during the really turbulent times of the restructure. Once you are embarked on your restructure, follow your processes. I have lost count of the number of organisations where I've worked where a restructure has been seen as a rather helpful mask for exiting people from the organisation who are not viewed as being particularly positive or adding value. A restructure is not the time to be doing quasi-disciplinary and capability activities. It is a time for following the process, because if you don't, any subversive activities which are masked by this big restructure label are almost certainly going to be unearthed. It's about being genuine and congruent about what you're doing. And frankly, if you've waited until a restructure to tackle people who aren't seeing as adding value, people who aren't positive, then what have you been doing? Those people should have been tackled using the appropriate mechanisms and the appropriate processes before your restructure. If you try to engineer the outcomes, you will almost certainly be caught out, and you will find it very difficult to respond to a challenge on that. You'll find it very difficult to convince an employment tribunal judge, for example, that this really was a restructure and not some kind of quasi-mass disciplinary exercise. So be very clear about that. Do not treat the restructure as a handy mechanism for getting rid of people that you're not particularly keen on keeping. To summarise, if you think you need to restructure, be absolutely clear about why. Your business case needs to be solid, clear and transparent. Review your policies and your procedures before you get into your restructure. Make friends, if you can, with your trade union representatives or your staff side reps, but include them in the process and value their opinion. Be clear with your staff, you cannot overdo the communications, but finally, be confident about it. If you're confident about your reasons and your processes for the restructuring, chances are everybody else will be too. But it needs good planning. Perestroika doesn't come easily.